The biggest issue facing West Berkshire at the moment is the risk of an uncontrolled, unquestioned Conservative government who only really seem to get their power from owning a media that shuts down any sense of viable opposition to them. The combined threats that we have seen already from a government that are challenging to housing, health, education, public service, mental health are really quite significant and really quite serious. And I think people in West Berkshire have shown that they don't buy into that view of what this area and our country needs to be. I think the way to solve that problem is to take power away from Westminster and to put a lot more back into local democracies, to engage people in the decision-making process and really address the issues in the way that is important and valuable to them. So I think enabling local people to decide how funding is collected and spent is the right way to address some of the issues and to challenge the real risks that this potential government has for us. The best outcome for us will ensure that the generally actually quite good protections for the environment, food standards, employment and human rights and sensible freedom of movement remain. I think we don't need to be distracted by the idea that the economy is going to stumble and fall and break, because it won't. It will always look after itself and we will always be a secondary consideration for it. But beyond arranging those things to stay in place, we need to ensure that our position remains as a forward-thinking, outward-looking, engaged nation ready to work alongside people in Europe and the rest of the world. We don't need to fall into the dangerous stories that are being told by a very small but quite powerful group within the Blue Kib Alliance that are now telling us that they have got this fantasy vision of a world that actually never existed, and that we need to be thinking about our children's futures and not some 1950s fantasy that is being peddled around at the moment. I think the fact that we are physically an island doesn't mean we need to be intellectually an island. We need to be able to look outwards, to connect, to work with everyone around the world, and make sure that my children are able to make use of every opportunity and excitement that the world has to offer. Quite simply, we'd be prepared to pay for them. We would create a culture that accepts that education, social care, housing, health are investments in all our futures and are good for all of us. We wouldn't fall into the trap of the short-term, headline-grabbing politics that's dragging us all down, and we would create a long-term, inclusive vision for all of our futures. The money, incidentally, does come from a fair and enforced taxation system, as well as the ending of expensive wastes such as Trident nuclear power and the active encouragement for profits to be filtered out of our public services and into the pockets of private companies and foreign governments. Firstly, we need to stop pretending that NHS funding is like some sweet little household budget. It's not. It's super complicated. It's connected with all other elements of society. So we have to have a grown-up, intelligent view of how these services are funded. We have to stop a group of really rather wealthy MPs voting through blatant privatisation policies that are selling off the pride of our nation and siphoning money into private bank accounts and business accounts that they're shareholders and directors of these businesses. I think that's a bit shady, and people are really quite put out when they discover the connection between these decision-making processes. Of course, we need to adjust our attitude to taxation, because stuff does need paying for, and we need to take a view that the payment of taxation actually is not some form of punishment. It's a privilege. If you're lucky enough to pay tax, pay it. Make your contribution. We all benefit from the National Health Service. We all benefit from a healthy nation. Also, of course, and probably most importantly, we need to connect up the range of policies that actually go together and stop seeing things as separate silos. Health investment actually is about a much more non-political picture. It's about education, mental health, children's centres, other social resources. If we take this seriously and take the responsibility to improve people's lives across the board, from the very beginning through to the very end of it, we'll all benefit. And actually we can halve the National Health Service bill within a generation. So it's common sense to invest rather than keep scrimping and saving for short-term soundbites. Homelessness is a problem across the nation, and West Berkshire is no different. There are actually hundreds of empty houses across the area. The use of a fraction of those would make a significant impact. That's one very quick, easy remedy that we can find. We could also work to stop making West Berkshire as an authority be such a soft touch for greedy developers who make arrangements and promises to build social houses and affordable housing, and then take land that's given away by the local authority and then never deliver on the promises that were part of the supposed deal. Then as a society we need to invest in an appropriate level of support, understand the reasons behind homelessness. It's not very often a deliberate choice, it's a consequence of family breakdown, mental health issues, poverty and many other serious and real issues that we actually could take a far more compassionate view towards. So if you don't want to be compassionate and help struggling people back into a life, then you might want to take an intelligent view of the situation and ensure that the services that we provide, stopping the homelessness happening in the first place through mental health support, through reducing the level of poverty, through reducing the stress that's on families, and so on. And this is interesting. Obviously, as a head teacher who's had to find thousands of pounds out of a non-existent budget to fund the previous policy, I've got questions that need answering about the infant free school meal policy as it is. The solution really is to actually start developing proper policies and not cheap soundbites. Come up with something for a reason, come up with something that means something. Of course, there is a very strong argument for the development of food in schools, not just from the nutritional and health benefits of it, but from the social and conversational skills that come from communal eating and from the whole way that schools can order themselves and actually bring up decent kids for the future. There's a great many reasons for it, but you can't just do it as a cheap soundbite. You can't just come up with some underfunded random thing that sounds good on the news at 10 and then actually real head teachers are forced to find money to staff this, to provide the facilities, to increase the size of their kitchens. The previous effort from the coalition government was a dog's dinner, not a school dinner. And what we need now is a proper joined up policy that relates to health as well as just simply putting some food on the table. My views are really quite clear on this one. This is an unnecessary waste of nearly £4 billion a year spent on HMS pointless, as it's often known, is not a way to address the issues and the challenges and threats that we face today. It's utterly useless against a terrorist organisation, it's utterly useless against cyber attacks. It's not the way that the world works, and it's no longer, I believe, a relevant solution. It's a Cold War relic that we need to be able to move on from. But I don't need people to start thinking that you've got a bunch of pacifist softies who are just going to sort of lie down and allow all the bad people in the world to take over. £4 billion a year is a lot of money. Now, if much of that was spent actually on providing the equipment that our armed services need, the services and support that they actually need when they come back from the trauma of conflict, and invest in that, we would have a decent, healthy, functioning armed forces that could actually provide a useful and relevant, when required, defence force. But we also need to invest in peace and the attitudes and the opportunities that the world offers us to engage in something a little bit more useful, productive, hopeful than just arming ourselves for the destruction of everybody on the planet. I don't believe it's relevant. I don't believe it's necessary use of the money. Quite simply, no. We dealt with this 12 years ago. We've moved on from it. It's an archaic, outdated practice. I genuinely don't understand it, and I actually know that it is a deeply unpopular idea. People don't want to go back to it. Now, I've got nothing against people dressing up and riding around. I think that's probably great fun if you're into, and I'm not knocking it. I just don't see why you need to bring in the tearing apart of a living creature at the end of this game. I think if you want to race around and jump around on horses, fill your boots, it's good. Blow your horns, and I don't genuinely have a problem with it. I just don't see why you need to bring in something so sort of brutal or unpleasant at the end of it. I genuinely don't get it. Time to move on from it. No, is the simple answer to that. I think this is really just comes down to this as a Conservative government trying to steal a few UKIP policies and drag us back to some, again, 1950s vision of the way our country should be. If they actually spent some time listening to professionals, listening to people involved in education, they would realise that there is no support for it because there is no evidence to back it up. This is not the solution to the problem that we've got. We need to change education. We need to change the way that we do things. We need to provide a variety of options for young people to thrive and become decent citizens. But taking us backwards isn't the answer. And I'm afraid, as with so many of this government's policies towards education, it's a case of them preparing and educating our children for our pasts rather than educating for our children's futures. So it's a really bad idea. It has no professional support and it needs to be binned. No, I wouldn't. I didn't. I'm a big advocate of tax in general, and I'm a big advocate of people making a contribution to our society that we can all benefit from. I think it's important to point out I'm not opposed to people being rich. I'm not anti-rich, I'm anti-greed. And I'm anti-people having an attitude that it was just their hard work that made them really rich. It wasn't. It was the good fortune of living in a country that is together and is able to provide health, roads, policing, armed forces, everything else that actually enables people to take those steps up. Yeah, they work hard. Yes, they deserve some benefit from that. But we as a society have to have a grown-up conversation about how we are organising ourselves and funding the things that are good for all of us. If you're lucky enough to take out, then you should be privileged enough to put back in. It really is as simple as that. I know people want to pass things on to their children, and that's absolutely right. And I think that you don't have to look too far to find some pretty spurious stealth tax arrangements going on at the moment with plans for paying for social care for those people unfortunate enough to become old and need care. That's not the way to lead the debate. It's not the solutions to the problems. But fundamentally, I see tax as a privilege and not a punishment, and we should all be very happy to pay it.